Caldwell drawing room was built to impress marble mantle, veined like frozen lightning velvet drapes, swallowing the winter light of fire snapping bright enough to polish the floorboards with gold. Yet the warmth stopped at the grate. It couldn't cross the rug to where Clara sat upright on the tufted settee, hands laced so tightly her knuckles blanched. Opposite her, Eleanor Caldwell stood like a carved standard thin smile honed to a blade. "If you cannot bear children," Eleanor said, each word laid out the way a jeweler lays out stones, "what use have you for the Caldwell name?" Clara kept her gaze steady, though the air seemed to thin in her chest. "I married your son because I loved him." "Love, Eleanor," replied the corner of her mouth, barely flicking, "neither secures legacy nor keeps land. We do not invest in sentiment here." By the hearth, Walter swirled his brandy, as if he were considering the fire's opinion on the matter. The flame licked the gold of his pocket watch and his face with equal indifference. Months ago, he had promised patience a lifetime, even in the soft hush of a different room. Now his silence sounded like a verdict. Walter, Clara said, not pleading, simply naming him as one might name a witness. He set the glass down. The click on mahogany was small and absolute. "Mother has made the practicalities clear," he said, voice smooth from practice. "We married for legacy, not for daydreams. If you can't give the family what it needs, there's no point pretending otherwise." The words landed with the quiet weight of a door closing. He slid off his ring, turned it once between finger and thumb, then let it rest on the sideboard as though returning a library book that no longer interested him. Clara glanced at the ring and then away. She had embroidered curtains for the guest room last spring. She had planned a cradle there in her head. The fire cracked. The room smelled of orange peel and brandy. She could not seem to feel her hands. A soft knock, the hush of practiced footsteps. The housekeeper appeared in the doorway, with a winter coat folded over her arms. No one said goodbye. The garment lay in the housekeeper's hold like a sentence already signed, Wool Button's exile. Clara rose because there was nothing left to do sitting. She took the coat without looking at Eleanor, without looking at Walter, and slipped her arms into the sleeves. The fabric was heavy. It helped her stand. "Go back to where you belong," Eleanor murmured almost kindly, as if issuing directions to the post. Clara nodded once. Not agreement, recognition. Then she turned toward the corridor past the silver-framed ancestors and the staircase that led to rooms she would not climb again, and walked out into the winter where truth has no upholstery and footsteps make their own answers in the snow. Snowflakes clung to Clara's lashes when she opened her eyes. The world around her was silent, white and merciless. She lay on her side in a shallow drift, her coat half frozen to her shoulders, her breath a ragged fog in the air. Her head pounded heavy with the residue of something bitter left in her blood. The last thing she remembered was tea in a porcelain cup steam curling in the parlor of the Caldwell house. Now there was only wilderness. Beside her sat a coarse canvas sack dusted with frost. With trembling hands, she pulled it closer. Inside, she found a single wool dress, rough and plain, a pair of boots worn at the heels, her coin purse, light as air, its contents stripped, and one folded scrap of parchment creased sharply as if pressed there with purpose. Clara unfolded it. The script was Eleanor's, precise and ruthless. "Go back to where you belong." The words cut colder than the snow. For a moment, she let the paper rest in her palm, her eyes burning with something hotter than the wind. But no tears came. None would. The woman who had been dismissed like a servant, discarded like refuse, had nothing left to spend on grief. She stood slowly, knees shaking under the weight of cold, her boots crunching through the crust of ice. Around her, the forest stretched, unbroken pine boughs sagging under snow, the sky already dimming toward dusk. No path, no road, no hand to guide her. Clara wrapped the coat tighter, shoved the parchment back into the sack, and began to walk. Step by step, breath after shallow breath, she pressed forward into the storm. She did not scream and she did not plead. The silence of the trees would not answer. She would not give them the victory of her despair. If she was to vanish in the wilderness, it would be walking, always walking toward a place of her own making. The forest was hushed under a veil of snow when Thomas Arnett trudged down the ridge, an armful of firewood, balanced against his shoulder axe hanging loose in his other hand. Winter had a way of swallowing sound, but even in the stillness, he felt something wrong, a shape that didn't belong beneath the crooked birch ahead. At first he thought it was only another drift of snow. Then the outline shifted, a figure curled in the white, too rigid, too fragile. His heart kicked hard against his ribs as he dropped the wood and strode closer. She lay crumpled on her side lashes, frosted lips, blue skin, pale as the snow itself. He brushed back a crust of ice from her cheek. A pulse flickered faintly at her throat, weak but there. Thomas swore under his breath. Whoever she was, she'd been abandoned to the storm too long. Behind him came a small voice. "Daddy, she's not dead." Eliza, his youngest, stood wide-eyed at the tree line, mittened hands clasped against her chest. She looked not at him but at the woman with a pleading earnestness only a child could hold. Thomas's jaw tightened. His rule had always been simple: no strangers. Strangers meant risk, trouble, weight too heavy for a house already stretched thin. Yet looking at the ghostly figure before him, her body brittle with cold, he felt the iron of that rule bend. Eliza took a step closer, whispering, "Please, she's not a stray. She's a lady." Thomas closed his eyes a moment, the truth clawing against his resolve. Then he exhaled sharply and stooped, sliding his arms beneath the woman's frail form. She was light frighteningly, so as though the world had already stripped her down to bone and shadow. He lifted her against his chest, turned toward the smoke curling faintly from the cabin chimney, and began the steady walk home. His boots crunched in the snow each step, breaking a vow he had once sworn, yet carrying the only choice his heart could live with. Thomas shouldered the cabin door open, boots scattering snow across the threshold. 4 pairs of eyes turned toward him, the children startled at the sight of the woman in his arms. "She stays one night," he muttered, though his own voice lacked conviction. He carried her into the back room, the smallest but warmest space, where the cot still held the quilt his late wife had stitched years ago. Setting the woman down, he saw how fragile she looked, as if a breath of wind might scatter her. He stoked the hearth until flames leapt high, filling the room with uneven warmth. A pot of water steamed nearby. He set it within reach, more out of instinct than thought. Then he returned to the bedside. Her face was flushed scarlet, now damp with sweat. Beneath closed lids, her eyes shifted restlessly, lashes trembling against skin too pale. Fever gripped her hard. Thomas dipped a cloth into the warm water and laid it gently across her brow. At first his hand was awkward, heavy as the axe he usually carried, but the longer he sat, the steadier his movements became. The woman stirred, whispering broken fragments, pleas, denials, words caught between sobs that never rose above a whisper. Her body jerked once, then curled inward, like she was still fighting something only she could see. He stood motionless, the damp cloth forgotten in his hand, watching the silent tears trail down her temples. Thomas had seen women cry in childbirth, seen men cry dying on battlefield, but this grief was different, quieter, lonelier, as if it had been buried too long. Something inside him, long sealed behind iron, softened. At last he pulled the quilt higher over her shoulders, tucking it in as firmly as he could, and turned down the lamp. He left the door ajar so he would hear if she stirred. Then he sat in the chair outside her room, silent sentry against the storm, listening to the uneven cadence of her breath. In that vigil without words, he chose not just to save her life for a night, but to guard it until she could stand again. Clara woke to the faint rattle of the wind against a window pane. For a moment she did not remember where she was. The walls were bare wood, the quilt heavy and unfamiliar. Then the scent of smoke and stew told her a cabin. She pushed herself upright, slowly, still weak but alive. Before she could gather her thoughts, the front door burst open. Micah stumbled in, half carrying his younger brother, Caleb. The boy's clothes clung wet against his thin frame, his lips tinged blue, his body shivering so violently his teeth chattered. He went to the creek. Micah gasped. Without boots. Clara's exhaustion fell away in an instant. She crossed the room swiftly, her own dizziness forgotten. Kneeling beside the boy, she pressed her hand to his forehead. Heat radiated from his skin, feverish and dangerous. "He's burning up," she said with certainty. "We must act now." The children froze, unsure. Clara's voice sharpened with authority. "Towels, firewood, herbs, peppermint, or thyme if you have them." Eliza darted off without hesitation, while the others stood wide-eyed, stunned that the fragile stranger in their home had suddenly become commander of the moment. Clara gathered Caleb into her arms. His weight was frighteningly light, his breath shallow against her shoulder. She carried him to the still warm bed she had just left, layering blankets over him. Her hands moved quickly, stripping away his wet clothes, rubbing his arms and chest to coax life back into them. She stoked the hearth until the fire flared bright, sending heat rolling through the room. Finding jars of dried herbs on the shelf, she crushed peppermint between her fingers, the sharp scent rising like memory. She poured boiling water over the leaves, steam fogging the air, then pressed the steep cloth gently against Caleb's chest to ease his breathing. His body resisted, at first trembling and tense, but under her steady touch it began to loosen. Finally, she sat beside him and began to hum. At first her voice cracked from dryness, but then it steadied into an old southern lullaby, slow warm, wrapping the room like another quilt. Lay down, little darling, the storm's rolling by. The melody carried more than words. It carried comfort, safety, the promise of a mother's arms. Caleb's frantic breaths eased. His eyelids fluttered heavy with sleep. Then in a whisper, almost lost to the crackle of the fire, he murmured, "Mama used to sing that." His small fingers curled into Clara's hand, clinging as if afraid she might vanish. Clara's lips parted, her throat tightening, but she pressed his hand gently and whispered back, "Rest now. I'm here." From the doorway, Thomas watched in silence. His arms were crossed, his face shadowed, but his eyes betrayed the weight of what he saw. Clara cast out, abandoned in the snow, now bent over his son with the calm competence of someone who refused to let life slip away. He said nothing, not even when Caleb's breathing slowed into steady rhythm. When at last the boy drifted into sleep, Clara brushed damp hair from his forehead and rose. Only then did Thomas step forward. Without words, he set a steaming cup of peppermint tea on the bedside table, an acknowledgement, an offering, though he did not linger to explain. Clara met his gaze, briefly saw something unspoken there. Respect, gratitude, perhaps the beginnings of trust. She sat back beside Caleb, fingers still resting lightly against his hand. Around her, the cabin felt different, less like a place she had been left in, and more like a place she could make whole. The lullaby faded into silence, but its echo remained, carried in the slow, even breaths of a boy who would wake to another day, because she had chosen not to give up. The cabin had gone still after Caleb finally drifted into a steady sleep. Clara sat at his bedside, her hands still loosely wrapped around his small fingers, her body heavy with both relief and exhaustion. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow across the quilt. From the doorway, Thomas stepped forward, his boots sounding lightly against the wooden floor. He didn't speak. Instead, he carried a steaming tin cup and set it carefully on the small table beside her. The scent of peppermint rose with the steam, sharp, calming, familiar. Clara looked up, startled at first, then met his eyes. For a fleeting moment, their gazes locked hers, weary but steady, his guarded, yet softened by something he did not name. No words passed between them, but in that silence there was acknowledgement. It was not a declaration nor a demand. It was the first quiet gesture of thanks offered without expectation. Thomas did not touch her shoulder, did not ask questions about the shadows that lingered behind her guarded eyes. He simply turned away, giving her the space to breathe. Clara wrapped her hands around the warm cup, letting the heat seep into her chilled fingers. For the first time since waking in this strange place, she felt a fragile thread of safety, woven not by promises, but by presence. Clara did not ask to stay, yet she was never asked to leave. Each dawn she rose with the light, her hands red from soap and snowmelt, as she swept pine needles from the floor or stirred oats thick over the hearth. Her presence slipped into the cabin like sunlight through shutters, quiet, steady, filling the spaces that had long gone untouched. The children began to orbit her in ways small but unmistakable. Micah squirmed while she trimmed his unruly hair, pretending to scowl, but secretly proud of the tidy cut. Eliza beamed when Clara braided her hair, weaving in strips of ribbon salvaged from an old blouse. She darned Jonah's socks without being asked, leaving the stitches so neat they looked new. And with patient hands, she guided Caleb through the slow art of tying bootlaces, letting him try twice until his knots held firm. At first, the children addressed her stiffly, Miss Clara, as though testing the name in the air. But soon it softened, carried on laughter, whispers, and the small offerings they brought. Eliza's wildflowers tucked behind Clara's ear, Micah's half-eaten biscuit left by her bedside, Caleb's constant tug at her sleeve. The name shifted into something warmer, woven with affection. Thomas, true to form, remained in the background. Yet Clara noticed his quiet support in ways others might not. Fresh-cut logs stacked beneath her window meant her fire never sputtered. The broken handle on her wash tub reappeared one evening, replaced with a smoother one carved by hand. The water bucket she left by the door never froze, though she never saw him tending it. He said nothing of these things, but the weight of his silence was not indifference. It was care carried out in the language he knew best. Piece by piece, stitch by stitch, Clara was mending more than clothes. She was stitching together the fabric of a family, her thread binding gently but firmly into their lives. The road into town was rutted with thawing mud, the wagon creaking as Thomas guided the team. The children huddled beneath quilts in the back, while Clara sat upright beside him, a basket of dried herbs resting against her skirts. She had insisted on coming. The children need new shoes, she had said, and though Thomas hesitated, one look at her steady gaze told him there would be no argument. The town bustled with noise and movement, wagons, rattling merchants shouting from open doors, neighbors calling across the street. Yet when Clara stepped down from the wagon, hand resting gently on Caleb's shoulder, a hush rippled through the street. Whispers darted like minnows in shallow water. The woman in the woods, living with the lumberjack and his brood, no ring on her hand. Clara did not flinch. She guided Jonah to the counter where he chose a bundle of pencils, helped Eliza select a length of sky blue fabric for a dress, and placed sturdy new boots on Caleb's small feet. Each act was quiet, practical, but it revealed a role no one could deny: caretaker-provider, the steady figure the children leaned upon. Inside the general store, the air smelled of leather flour and lamp oil. Clara's basket filled quickly with thread cloth and small necessities. At the counter, the shopkeeper peered at her over wire spectacles. "You the new Arnett woman?" he asked, suspicion edging his tone. Clara gave a polite smile. "No, sir, just helping with the children." Before another word could be spoken, Caleb came running from the doorway, a slingshot clutched in his hand. He barreled into her skirts, breathless with excitement. "Mama!" He caught himself too late, cheeks flushing. "I mean, Miss Clara." The room stilled. All eyes turned. Clara's face softened. She knelt, kissed the crown of his head, and whispered, "It's all right." Outside, Thomas loaded sacks of flour into the wagon. A man leaning on a post smirked. "Looks like you've got yourself a new wife." Thomas didn't look up. "She's not mine," the man chuckled. "Sure doesn't look that way." Only then did Thomas turn, his voice low but steady, carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "She may not be mine, but she's the first good thing those children have had in a long time." The words settled heavier than a shout. The smirk faded. Around them, the watching townsfolk grew silent, their gossip curdling into something closer to respect, or at least hesitation. When Clara emerged with the children clustered around her, cheeks pink from the cold and arms full of parcels, Thomas offered his hand to help her into the wagon. He did not explain himself, nor did she ask. But as the horses started forward and the town receded behind them, a new weight hung in the air, not of shame, but of belonging. The letter arrived with Jonah one gray afternoon, its wax seal still unbroken, the parchment stiff with formality. Clara's name was written in Walter's neat, commanding hand, a hand she had once traced in tenderness, now carrying only the sting of memory. She opened it at the hearth, the children bustling softly nearby. The words were as cold as the marble floors she had once walked. "Jessica, mother is dying. The family estate needs you. You are still my wife in the eyes of the law. Return and all can be restored. This family is ready to welcome you back." There was no warmth, no apology, only the heavy presumption that she remained his to summon. Tucked within the folds was a velvet pouch. Clara's fingers trembled as she loosened the drawstring. Out slid the gold band Eleanor had stripped from her hand that night, gleaming in the firelight like a shackle rediscovered. The room seemed to tighten around her, every breath shallow. She folded the letter quickly, hiding it in her apron, but the damage had already seeped in. At supper, the children sensed it. Eliza leaned closer, watching her with worried eyes. Caleb fidgeted, dropping his spoon more than once. Even Jonah, who rarely spoke, ate in brooding silence. The air was thick with something they could not name, but felt in their bones, a shadow pressing in at the edges of their fragile home. Clara forced her hands steady as she ladled stew into bowls, but her eyes kept straying to the folded parchment in her pocket. Each glance was like touching a bruise that would not heal. Across the table, Thomas said nothing. He did not question her, did not press for explanation. But his gaze, quiet, steady, unyielding, met hers more than once, as if to remind her she was not alone against the ghosts clawing back from her past. The clink of cutlery and the crackle of the fire were the only sounds that filled the room. Yet beneath them lay the truth: the letter had reopened a wound, and the ring had tried to chain her to a life she had already buried. What Eleanor and Walter did not understand was that Clara had already found a place where her worth was not measured in heirs or legacy, but in the laughter of children and the silent respect of a man who would never demand what was not freely given. The fire snapped in the hearth, throwing restless sparks as Clara sat motionless, the letter unfolded in her lap. The words blurred. She wasn't reading anymore, only remembering marble floors, Eleanor's voice like ice, and Walter's indifferent hand stripping the ring from her finger as if it had never meant anything. She rose quietly. The room held its breath. Thomas sat nearby, knife paused over a block of wood, his eyes following her without a word. Clara stepped closer to the flames, the letter trembling in her hands. With deliberate care, she tore it into strips. The parchment resisted, thick and expensive, but she kept going until every line of Walter's command lay in tatters. One by one, she dropped the pieces into the fire. They curled, blackened, and turned to ash. Last came the ring. She held it up to the light, the gold catching a brief glimmer before the firelight claimed it. For a heartbeat, she remembered the weight of promises broken, the humiliation of being discarded. Then, with a steady breath, she let it fall. The band struck the grate with a sharp final chock before the coals swallowed it whole. The sound rang louder than any vow, a severing not just of legality, but of power. Thomas didn't rise, didn't speak. He only watched his jaw, set his eyes steady, not questioning, not doubting, simply bearing witness to the choice that was hers alone to make. When Clara turned back to him, the flames warming her face, her voice came low, but unwavering. "Because this is the first place someone called me mother." Silence stretched, but it was no longer heavy. It was whole. Thomas inclined his head, a single nod, small but absolute. He understood, without needing to say it, the past had no claim on her anymore. The fire roared softly, consuming the remnants of a life she had left behind. And in that cabin, among children's laughter and a man's unspoken steadiness, Clara chose not what she had lost, but what she had found, a present that belonged entirely to her. The cabin did not change in a single day, nor with vows or proclamations. It changed slowly, quietly, as if each ordinary task wove another thread into a life they had begun to share. Thomas never spoke of it, he simply built. A small table appeared, first carved with winding vines and foxgloves, like the ones Clara tended in the garden. Then came a new window frame angled, so the morning light would fall exactly where she had once said it reminded her of Georgia dawns. Clara noticed these things, though Thomas never called attention to them. Above the stove, a neat shelf appeared, each jar labeled in his square, careful handwriting, "Peppermint Wild Thyme Lavender." It was his way of saying he saw her work valued. It gave it permanence in their home. She touched the jars, often smiling at the simple order that made her feel she belonged. The storm that first pushed her into his bed left no scar on the room. From that night forward, there was no need for a separate cot. Their breaths fell into rhythm in the same space, the lines between his and hers dissolving into theirs. They didn't call it marriage. They didn't speak of binding vows or promises written on paper. What they shared was steadier, the repetition of presence, the unspoken agreement to show up every day. Clara's hands, once tentative, grew confident in this new rhythm. She hummed as she cooked or mended, her voice mingling with the sound of Thomas's saw or his low whistle at the lathe. When she found sunlight streaming across the bed in that perfect angle, her Georgia light, she knew it wasn't chance. It was him, listening without asking, giving without needing thanks. No words were exchanged, no rings offered, yet a home was forming plank by plank, jar by jar, quiet as the mountain air. And in that silence, stronger than any spoken oath, their life together took root. It happened in the quiet of an ordinary afternoon. Clara had gone to the blackberry patch, trimming brittle vines with steady focus, her gloves too thin to stop the thorns that bit deep into her fingers. She didn't notice the blood until drops dotted the leaves bright against the green. Thomas saw before she did. In 3 strides, he was beside her, crouching low, his rough hands reaching for hers. She braced for reproach, a gruff word about being careless, but it never came. Instead, his touch was deliberate, almost reverent. One by one, he eased each thorn from her skin, slow and careful, as though the smallest slip might wound more than her hand. When the last thorn was gone, he lifted her fingers toward his lips and blew across the raw cuts, cooling the sting. Then he wrapped her hand with a strip of clean cloth, tying it firm but gentle, his callous thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles before he let go. Clara looked up, meeting his eyes. They were unreadable, steady as ever, but his hands had already spoken for him. No declarations, no grand promises, just care exact enough to be love. In that moment, she understood his love was not a thing of words or spectacle. It was in the presence, the patience, the quiet tending that turned pain into proof. With every thorn he removed, he had told her without saying so, "You are not alone. Not now. Not ever." The first sign was small. Clara stumbling as she carried a basket of eggs across the yard, the shells breaking around her like pale suns in the snow. A cry from Eliza pierced the air, and Thomas was there in an instant. He scooped Clara into his arms as though she weighed nothing, his face tight with fear, and carried her straight into the cabin. Her skin burned with fever, her breath ragged and shallow. Thomas laid her on their bed, piling quilts high against the chill. All through the night, he remained at her side, refusing rest. He wiped the sweat from her brow with a damp cloth, lifted spoonfuls of broth to her lips, and whispered low reassurances, though she could not always hear him. His hands, rough from axe and plow, moved with a gentleness that astonished even himself. Near midnight, Clara stirred. Her voice was faint, broken. "I'm sorry," she whispered, as if guilty for collapsing under the weight she had carried too long. Thomas shook his head firmly. "You don't apologize for giving more than you had." His words held the weight of both rebuke and devotion. He took her hand, then, holding it as though it was the one fragile truth that anchored them both. For a long moment he studied her face, sweat-soaked, pale, yet still radiant with the strength that had carried her through storms no one else had seen. His voice softened, carrying the confession he had held back since that night in the snow. "If you were my wife," he murmured, "you would never have been left there." Her fever-bright eyes shimmered. She didn't need vows or a ring to understand. In that quiet moment, she knew this was home, and he was already hers. He cabin kitchen slowly transformed into something more than a place for bread and stew. With nothing but chalked ash from the hearth and a battered horseshoe strung with a bent spoon, Clara created a classroom. Each morning she rang that improvised bell, her voice steady as she called the children to gather. They sat on crates, old rugs, and straw bales, wide-eyed as she traced letters across smooth planks of wood. Coal dust became her ink, the wall her blackboard. She taught them to string words into sentences, to count on their fingers, and tally sums in the margins of scrap paper. When the lessons grew heavy, she shifted to stories, folk tales, parables, scraps of poetry remembered from her grandmother's voice. Her tone was low and certain, weaving through the timbers like birdsong after a long winter. At first it was only Thomas's children. Then others began to appear, thin boys from a ridge farm whose parents had nothing to offer but hope, a girl barefoot from 3 miles down the valley, stubbornly declaring she wanted to learn her name in letters. Clara welcomed them all. No one was turned away. The news spread quietly. There was a school in the mountains, though it looked nothing like the red schoolhouses in the towns below. They began to call it the Red Schoolhouse anyway, for the shawl Clara wore each morning as she stood at the doorway, smiling as the children filed in. And soon, where once there had been silence, the cabin hummed with laughter, recitation, and the sound of pencils scratching, proof that even in a wilderness light could be passed from one hand to another. It began with small gifts from the valley, proof that Clara's presence was no longer seen as scandal, but as grace. A bent woman arrived one afternoon, carrying a bundle wrapped in worn linen. Inside lay a pale blue silk scarf frayed at the edges, faintly scented with lavender. "My sister was a teacher in Georgia," the woman said. "She never had children of her own, but she taught 100. Clara pressed the fabric to her cheek, eyes misting, and tied it into her hair that night as she read by candlelight. It was the valley's way of saying she belonged. Then, not long after, a boy came from the orphanage. Silent, wiry, and fierce-eyed, he lingered at the edges of the class, arms crossed, refusing food, refusing words. For 3 days, he watched the others trace letters in soot and hum their lessons. Clara did not press him. She let him be her patience, steady as snowfall. On the fourth day, as the children gathered their books and scattered, he stayed behind. For a long while he stared at the chalk marks on the wall, his small hands trembling. Then without warning he crossed the room and wrapped his arms around Clara's waist. His voice cracked like thin ice, scarcely more than a whisper, "Mama." Clara froze her throat, tightening her heart, thundering. Slowly she bent to gather him close, her hand cradling the back of his head. "I'm right here," she whispered into his hair, her voice trembling with tears. "I'm not going anywhere." It was the second time the word had been spoken, but this time it felt like a christening, a name claimed not by blood, but by choice. A family was being written letter by letter in voices that had once been lost. By the time a full year had passed, the cabin no longer echoed with silence. It rang with lessons, laughter, and the clatter of extra bowls at supper. Where once Thomas's table had only held his 4 children, now it stretched longer, sturdier, with extra chairs pulled up for the orphans and wanderers who had found shelter in their care. It was no longer just a house in the mountains. It had become a home widened not by walls but by hearts. Thomas, never a man of many words, found other ways to speak. One crisp winter morning, Clara stepped onto the porch and saw a wind chime swaying above the door. It was made from old silver spoons, polished smooth each one, catching the pale sun and clinking together in a chorus both fragile and enduring. When she turned, Thomas was there, rubbing the back of his neck. "Each spoon," he said quietly, "is a thank you I never managed to say." Clara didn't answer. She simply reached up, touched one of the spoons, and let its soft music fill the space between them. Behind the cabin, Clara had started her own tradition. On a great pine tree near the garden, she nailed small wooden planks, each carved with the name of a child who had passed through their door. Jonah's, Micah's, Eliza's, Caleb's, all etched with care. Then came Sarah, Nathan, Ruth, and the boy who had once whispered, "Mama." At the very top, she placed one that read simply, "Clara's Tree." The pine stood like a living testament, branches heavy with snow names glowing in the lamplight each evening. Every gust of wind carried the chiming spoons on the porch, blending with the creak of the tree out back, a duet of gratitude and remembrance. In those sounds lived the story of what they had built together, a place where the cast-off found belonging, and where love, unspoken but steady, multiplied with every name added to the wood. There was never a wedding bell, no preacher, no paper to bind them. Yet every evening the truth of their union sat plainly on the table. 4 bowls already waiting before Clara took her seat, a coat hung beside Thomas's on the rack, and a hand reaching for hers whenever the wind howled against the cabin walls. These were vows spoken not in words, but in rhythms of shared life. Inside, the warmth was stitched together by ordinary acts that had become extraordinary in their constancy. Clara's voice filled the room as she read stories aloud by the fire. The children leaned against her knees, eyes heavy with sleep, their laughter giving way to steady breaths. "Sleep well, my love," she whispered each night, her words carrying the weight of promises deeper than any ink on a page. From the porch, the silver spoons Thomas had fashioned into a wind chime answered softly, their music weaving into the quiet like a hymn. The world outside might measure love in land deeds, rings and heirs, but in this small cabin on the edge of the mountain, love was measured differently. It was in the bread kneaded together at dawn, the firewood stacked without thanks, the scars tended without judgment. A voice lingers over the closing scene. She could not bear children, but she bore love, and that was more than enough. The camera drifts back from the frosted window, showing the lamplight glowing against the night, the wind singing through the spoons, and a family chosen imperfect, enduring, resting, safe inside. Out in the wild, where storms and whispers once defined her, Clara had found what mattered most, not legacy, not lineage, but home.